So, what is today's video about? Because today's video is technically a key aircraft video, but I'm looking at a whole series of aircraft, and I'm talking about Sweden. Well, it's a sort of introduction to what I plan to do with all the footage we've done on the ScandiShip trip. Because there is a very easy diagram you can draw for where the footage goes when you're talking about Clarke's channel. There is a very easy diagram you can draw where it goes for Gary's channel. But often I get asked, well, what do you do with the footage, Alex? Well, I started this plan last year, but I didn't get to deliver those videos because of my mum being ill. So those videos are actually parked and coming out this year. So this year, over Christmas, you're going to get both the Australia trip and the Scandi trip videos in terms of the way I want to do them, which is a whole strategic contextual discussion of why they're picking the ships they're doing, why they're doing the things they're doing. And so to introduce that all, I thought it'd be really cool to start off with a look at Sweden's alternative torpedo punch. Now, I have to say this though. Again, I'm recording this before I get home, so I do not have access to the normal notes and all the other things I do. But seeing as, again, this was going to be a bit of a theoretical one and a bit of a contextual, nuanced and strategic one, I can do that. And I will probably do proper videos, individual videos about all these individual aircraft rather than a collective one of why they're buying these aircraft and why they're approaching these aircraft at some point in the future. Because they are quite interesting aircraft, even if they are produced in very, very small batches. And speaking of the ScandiShip trip, at the end of this video, there's not only going to be the usual question, there's also going to be about half a dozen to 10 pictures randomly selected from the trip, which I just think you'll find fun. And they're just going to flick through quietly, and then it's going to be the end screen. So if you please do hold on to the end for those. So this is often the question when we start talking about Sweden, because we look at Norway and we often say Sweden is far more prepared than Norway. They are. Does this mean they're prepared for war? No. Sweden's government had been almost as pacifistic and almost as much on the war is over, we can afford to ignore war completely bandwagon as the Norwegian government. They just have three massive advantages. One, they have a larger population and a larger industrial base to work from. Two, they have Bofors and several other companies, but Bofors are the one we're going to pick on. They can produce a lot of weapons very quickly. They have a large military industrial complex for their size. And three, they actually had a slightly more consistent policy to keeping up what they had that gave them a better base to start from. So whereas the Norwegians have gone, pieces going over, pieces are breaking out all over, we don't need to worry about things, we can afford to let everything go. The Swedes went, pieces breaking out, yes, but Russia is a total mess in that direction, and they might get their act together, and we do not have traditionally the best relationship with Russia, or with whoever rules Russia, and so we'd better have something. It's kind of like the Finnish. Again, they have a situation, and by the way, the videos I'm going to be doing on the Finnish and the Estonian strategies, they're going to be really cool. They're probably not going to be the sort of topics which get a lot of clicks on them on YouTube, but I really like them. They're going to be really cool. And the Swedish, well, they are very much prepared. And again, there's going to be a whole video on Swedish strategy and its long-term policy. They are prepared to prepare, if that makes sense. So they are not prepared for war in the early 1930s. They are not. But whereas Norwegians are not even prepared to prepare for war, the Swedes are in that far better position they can. And they have these lovely coastal defense ships, they have all sorts of vessels organized. They have a very layered approach to their defense. Now, one of their weak spots though is air power. That is a weak spot for them. They have all these ships, and when the Germans are looking and assessing their positions, they're going, well, they're going to have minefields, and the minefields are going to be covered by coastal batteries. And if we go in to engage the coastal batteries to clear the minefields, they're going to be torpedo boats. And if we send the ships we send in to take out the torpedo boats, they're going to be dealt with by the coastal defense ships. And everything builds up and builds up and builds up and all this stuff. But one thing they don't really talk about is Swedish air power. And there's a reason they don't really talk about Swedish air power. Because the Swedes have a very big problem. They are trying to build up their domestic aircraft capability, and they do build some of their own aircraft, and sometimes what they do is they buy a type from someone, and they'll get some from one, and then they'll try and build them themselves. But this is why when I'm talking about its aircraft, I'm saying, well, it doesn't really matter the stats of the aircraft, because if you consider the Heinkel HD-16 torpedo bomber, they had 2 of those. So they could have the best stats in the world, but it wouldn't matter. When we're at this strategic level, when we're discussing them, their individual performance isn't actually that great. They are aircraft of their era, but the fact is there's so few, it just doesn't matter to get in there. And then you have the Svenska Jaktfalken, which was their Swedish-built biplane fighter aircraft, which was an interesting aircraft. And as you go down this list, you don't get a good picture. You really don't. What you get is a picture of a nation searching for its strategic rationale of its aircraft. It's trying to build an air capability whilst really not seeing the need for it, because it doesn't see war as a likelihood. That's the thing. When you're talking about the naval forces, when you're talking about the coastal defense artillery, all those things, they're built already, they exist already. It's maintaining and upgrading them. It's not letting them fall apart. That's why I say they are prepared to prepare for war. But when it comes to air power, life is not so good. And I have to admit, I put this together with the help of 2 books and checking Wikipedia. And the reason I checked Wikipedia and its source list is because I was worried I'd missed something. I was literally looking at this list and going, I must have missed something. I went back, I hadn't. In fact, I think I have an aircraft in there which you can't find on the Wikipedia list, but I can't remember which one it is. Which I found in the book, and they have, it's the B5A, which I've listed as 1, I think. Of the Hawker Hart. What is interesting about all this and putting all this together was that you realize that what were the Swedes searching for? They have the Junker Ju-86 bomber aircraft, and that they have quite a few of. They 72 ordered from Germany between 36 and 41. Ju-86, not really a bomb we hear a lot about, but it's their largest aircraft, and they use it for all sorts of different missions and all sorts of different roles. But again, it's not that great. Their main advantage was that they are a long way from anywhere in terms of the ranges of aircraft in World War II in that period. And one of the things that was worked out quite early on by the Germans especially was if they attacked them, well, their own fighters would not have the fuel to escort their bombers the full way, which would mean their limited fighter aircraft, which, let's be honest, you've got the Reggiani Falco 1, you've got the Sversky P-35, and some Hawker Harts, and Bristol Bulldogs are still in service till 1940. Don't get me started on the Fokker CVs, which are still in service till 1945. And yeah, even the Svenska Aerojafkan is in service till 1941. They could actually do their job. But we're not talking about fighters here. We're talking about the torpedo bombers. And you start off with the 2 T1s, that's the Heinkel HD-16s. And then you go through and go, well, there aren't a lot of torpedo bombers being ordered hang on, then there's HE-115 torpedo bomber seaplane, which they get 12 of them. And honestly, this makes a lot of sense for them. It makes a lot of sense for the Swedish, because again, if you consider the amount of lakes they have, the water they have around them, seaplanes, they're a mobile strike force. They are a strike force they can base from anywhere. That gives them a lot of strategic mobility. That's a useful asset, but they got 12 of them. And then we have the Caproni CA313. And its torpedo bomber variant, the T-16, they create 14 of in 1941. Now you should realize that a lot of the Caproni CA313s are built in Sweden. So they do not take a lot of deliveries from Italy. They build a lot of them themselves. And that's the other thing they've been working through. They've been trying to build up their own industry to build up their own aircraft. Now, if these torpedo bombers aren't that numerous, why do they matter? Why am I linking them into the strategic defense of Sweden? Well, Sweden needed them. Sweden has a very interesting strategic scenario for it in terms of the Baltic. The Baltic is different from the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or any of those for 3 reasons. One, it freezes over completely. It can do, and in that way you need an icebreaker to get anywhere. So, yeah, it's not good. It's also quite shallow in parts, so ideally you want a torpedo aircraft which specializes in shallow water attacks. Interesting enough here, what do you not see here? You see no British-built torpedo bombers. They're German and they're Italian. Now, the Italians sort of should be focusing on that because of the Mediterranean, but the Germans certainly didn't focus in on that. They didn't do enough work to focus in on that. And there are no British. The British are the ones who are focusing on harbour attack. But the British do such a good job of keeping it quiet that not even the Swedes know what the British are up to on that front. That's quite scary to think about because the Swedes are some of the most plugged in, one of the most plugged in nations in the world when it comes to defence procurement. And if we consider early on, they bought Bulldogs, they bought Gloucester Gladiators, they bought Hawker Harts, they bought a lot of British aircraft. Buying a British torpedo bomber, especially something like a Fairy Swordfish or a Blackburn Shark or Seal, would have made a lot of sense. Those are good long-range torpedo bombers. They are flexible. They're always designed to be in float. They can be used as float planes, or they can be used as land planes. So they can have wheels, or they can have floats underneath them. They are good, flexible assets. They should be your number one buy if you're Sweden. But you don't know what the British are doing with them, and so you are diversifying your procurement to make sure you're not too dependent on any one nation. Not linked into any one alliance. Strategic freedom. And so that's what they've done. They've gone with German, and Italian. Now, in terms of maritime strike aircraft, there are a lot of these aircraft can be used for that role. And that's, again, something the Swedes really do think about. They really do think about their strategic depth, because the Baltic is their strategic depth. Once you're across that, you're into Sweden. Once you're across that on their shores, you're into Sweden. And while Sweden is vast in so many ways and is full of wonderful countryside, I know I've been from it on trains, it is also concentrated. Stockholm, Gothenburg, these are the major population centres. There are a couple of others, and you need to secure those spaces. And let's be honest, Gothenburg is not far from Denmark. Why did I say Gothenburg? Gothenburg just isn't far from Denmark. Skip ahead a couple minutes if you don't want to see this, but as you all know, in every single video I do a shameless book plug. I do it because, well, I love doing YouTube for all of you. I really do. And I love that when the channel grows. I like it being shared, liked, subscribed to, all those things, because it allows me to reach more people. It helps with the algorithm to reach more people if more people like, share and subscribe. And it allows me, therefore, to hopefully spread the love of naval history and the context of naval history, the history of it, the nuance, the strategy, all those things, the things that fill out the edges of the puzzle that is humans' history. But I'm also an academic, and if I want to keep being hired for academic posts, and if I want to eventually get a permanent post, I need to make sure I sell books. At the moment, that's Travels, Battles and Darings. That's the only book I have out with a publisher. And it's a good one. It's about destroyers. And there's going to be a lot of videos in this series about the Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish and Estonian strategy, which is going to cover destroyers, because they're quite important ships to it. And submarines. Submarines are really cool. Submarines are in the pictures at the end because we found the last, and we're certain this, the last British submarine from the 1930s. British built 1930 submarine, and it's in Tallinn, Estonia. And you have to understand, this was a big surprise because all the sources we've been reading had referred to it as a Soviet boat, as an Estonian boat, Soviet boat, Estonian boat. And yeah, we've been reading all the sources that we've been given by the museum, etc., in preparation for turning up. When we turned up, went, that's not a Soviet-built vessel. And at that point, I have to admit, I did something which I probably should have done a while ago. I wikied it. I went, oh my god, it's not. And then I went and checked their file facts, and eventually I found the signs, which were all in English, and it was all details about it being built, and it's British built, and none of us had known about it. Which makes us feel completely dense, by the way. It really did make it really was a very, oh, frigate. But we didn't know any submarines had survived, the British submarines, and all the sources we'd read before we went. And you can tell this is true because who wasn't with us for the trip to Estonia? Drac. Drac has gone home. Do you think Drac would have got on a plane if he'd realised that submarine was in Tallinn, Estonia? No. Dr. Dan also got on a plane home. He left before we even got to Finland. He would never have gone if we'd realised. Literally, you had me, Gareth the Brit, and that's Gareth, and Dan, our chemistry, the guy who's helping us with explosives, standing there going, you don't put this on your website. I just stood there for about 10 minutes just staring at her going, it was surreal. Yesterday was surreal. So there's going to be a lot about submarines as well coming up. It's not so much discovered her as we didn't realise she existed. And the thing is, we're fairly plugged in naval historians. We talk to a lot of people. I called up a lot of my academic contacts. A lot of them didn't realise she existed either. I was thinking, it's quite worrying. Anyway, basically, all of the Swedish stuff starts with Nils Otto Fredrik Soderberg, who is charged with procuring an air force. And this was a lovely picture of him when he's older. But he basically is charged with not only procuring an air force, but with developing an air industry. And this is the policy he pursues. He doesn't know how long he has, he doesn't have much budget, but he's doing his best to prepare Sweden as best he can. And interestingly enough, the Swedes are very much not pursuing a policy of the air is going to be all powerful. They're looking at the air as including it within their strategic framework, which explains a lot of the choices he probably makes, but also explains why, when you add in the strategic framework, one of the priorities of Swedish strategic framework is to be able to build and operate their own industry, to sustain their own industry. And let's be honest, they have access to great quality metallurgical science. So they have a fine basis for aero engines and aircraft manufacture. They have a lot of the materials you need for aircraft manufacture. They have a lot of the capabilities and skills you need. So they have a fine basis to work from. But he doesn't have much money. Now, I say this as someone who has also toured around a museum which is literally in a Swedish airbase, a former Swedish airbase, which is built inside of a hill. It is literally hundreds of meters down in granite, it feels like. Might not be hundreds of meters down, but well, it's already down that far before you get to the entrance, and then it's down that again. So it could actually be close, a little over 100 meters below the surface. And that's just me estimating it on my walk down, on how far I had to walk down and how steep the incline was. And they are great at this. But they invest in all of that during and post World War II for the Cold War. They really went heavily in on the we are going to be a survivable force asset for a Cold War scenario. And that was because of the value of aircraft which they learnt during World War II. Now, I have to admit, they did expand their air force quite dramatically during World War II. They also expanded rifle production, they rearmed their army, they modernized a lot of their fleet during World War II, and they started designing a lot of big destroyers, which is where the Småland and Holland class, those two systems come from, although they only complete 2 of the 4 of those. Those destroyers are wonderful, by the way. They really are. If you are ever near Gothenburg, the one group was pronouncing Maritima, one group was pronouncing it Maritiman. I'm going to go with Maritiman. Museum is actually an excellent place to go, and they really deserve all the support they can get. They need it. But Frederick's main policy, Nils also Frederick Stoltenberg's main policy, I keep calling him Frederick because Nils' main policy is we have to be independent. We have to be capable because we cannot rely on any others because of our situation. Because they are in the Baltic. Let's say they rely on America for their imports and they find themselves in a war with Germany. Well, how are they going to get their imports through? Across Norway? Well, if Norway declares itself neutral and doesn't want to be part of the war, they might not, they might do that. They don't know. Norway is not the most strategically strong country militarily at this point. Can you guarantee they won't go with neutrality to protect themselves? In which case they won't allow stuff to across them. In which case, to get supplies from America, you'd have to run the gauntlet of Germany. Not going to work. What happens is the same with Britain. What about if you get all supplies from Germany and you end up with war with Russia? Well, you could have a similar issue. But also, Germany is an economy which is a fractious economy at this point. The Weimar Republic, they don't have a lot of faith in the stability of, and when it becomes a dictatorship, they have even less faith in the stability of it. It's one of the interesting things when you're dealing with Sweden is that, yes, there are people who like the idea, like the fascist government in Germany. There are in many countries. They see them as strong. They see them as purposeful. There's also quite a lot of people who look at them and go, so they are a strong, purposeful country which has an ego problem, and their ego can only be satiated by conquest. That's not a good situation to be in. That's the problem, usually, when you have such a strong, purposeful leadership. They tend to, A, believe they're always right, and B, thirst for more laurels. Once they've won one thing, they have to win another, and another, and another. So he's really faced with a very difficult task, and pretty much he is the person who we should be thinking about when all these decisions are made. And as said, shipshape, ScandiShip24, this is why we're in Sweden, this is why we're in Finland now. While we were in Estonia yesterday, we went there for a day trip from Helsinki. Beautiful, very good ferry, by the way, very easy trip. Ferries have been very good to us in the Baltic. I highly recommend you doing them if you're traveling around the Baltic. And while we were in Norway, while we've done all this. And there is going to be a lot of behind the scenes footage and a lot of other footage, probably including our reactions to seeing, I think one of us was filming when we saw the Olympic for the first time. I think one of us was filming. Honestly, those minutes have gone. So here's the HD-16. They had two of these, and really they used them to test out the idea of a torpedo bomber, of its capabilities, of what it can provide them with. And mostly it provides them with a lot of reasons for maintenance. They were not the most reliable aircraft known to mankind, but they did prove useful for reconnaissance, and in several exercises they proved fairly capable. They provide them with a strategic ability to do what the Swedes, and I am translating here, call closing the back door. I am translating, okay? I am translating and cleaning up the language of. A little bit for my channel. My little cousins watch this from it. And basically the idea was anything attacking in would be attacking into those defenses, and it was far more easy for these aircraft to swing round behind the enemy and attack from behind. So you could be attacking into a minefield, all sorts of things, and you would suddenly have torpedo bombers behind you. But having two of them, that's not really enough to help you. That's not really going to achieve anything, is it? So they start working on more. And first thing they work with is the Ju-86K, which is the first thing which is their largest bomber aircraft. It's a solid medium bomber. It really is a solid medium bomber. And their idea with this is, again, they could do level bombing, and they could do they could possibly do some torpedo work. They do look at the idea of fitting torpedoes. They never officially go through with it. But here's the thing. How do I explain? The more you travel around Sweden and look at their museums, the more you notice three things. Mines, artillery, and torpedoes. They turn up everywhere. In Norway, it's the history of fortifications. For the Swedes, fortifications are their bases for mines, artillery, and torpedoes. And they have absolutely no favoritism when it comes to them. I'd also point out that the more I've traveled around Sweden, the more I've looked at things and gone, you have an excessive amount of that which is supposed to be non-lethal. For example, illumination rocket launchers on things like the Småland. Now, they have about 8 on each turret, 6 to 8 on each turret, depending on how you add it up, which would make sense. But then they have other launchers as well. Box launchers at various positions on the ship, and it can be fitted with more. To the point at which you realise that you're talking dozens upon dozens of these rockets could be carried. I don't know about you, but I'm highly suspicious of why they would need dozens upon dozens of illumination rockets. To be, well, in the nicest way, you might fire them, but then you can reload. Why do you need so many ready to go and independent launchers that you can aim independently from the guns? I just have a slight suspicion that maybe there was a different warhead available other than the illumination one for the rockets, but I can find no proof of that. It's just years of being a naval historian, years of following my father around dockyards when they were building warships, years of being just suspicious, I suppose, build up on that one. So the Ju-86K, technically not a torpedo bomber, technically used for bombing, and supposed to be, their strike missions range from counter formations at sea to also attacking enemy harbours, attacking their infrastructure for attacking them. The Swedes were very practical in that perspective. They didn't have enough to go after and do mass bombing campaigns, but they felt if they could do a targeted bombing campaign, which is interesting with that level of technology, they could have an impact. Targeted bombing could have an impact. That was their theory. Then we have the HE-115 torpedo bomber. And that was particularly interesting. It was a very flexible, longer range, larger strike torpedo bomber. It truly is. It's not a two-seater aircraft. It is something which is requiring more crew, more capability, and it can definitely operate from water pretty much anywhere. This is an advantage. Whilst the Baltic does freeze over, there is usually enough water able to be made to operate these. And that can be, if necessary, be using an icebreaker. They tend to have quite a lot of those running around the Baltic. They are a strategic asset, and again, a very interesting experience, not today and not yesterday, but the day before, was finding a 1907 built daughter of the Tyne, the Torma, icebreaker, which had only finished service in 1970, and she's sitting in the National Maritime Museum in Finland and is a really beautifully preserved vessel. Anyway, the HE-115 has a longer strike range, it's far more flexible, it's a far better example of a torpedo arm. But the trouble is, just as they're getting enough of these and they're considering starting to build more, well, mustachioed man, aka Hitler, decides to go for a wander and decides to start causing wars, which means they don't get enough of the equipment they need to start building their own. They need templates, they need various components for the machine parts to machine things for the aircraft. And whilst they do manage to produce enough fabrication facilities to provide for their maintenance and repair and keep them in service, they don't really have much of a choice. Now, I'd also add the whole way through, one of the interesting things they do with their aircraft, and if I flick back, he says, quite a lot of these aircraft do not have their standard engines. The Swedes, again, will often modify their engines. So you might get a German-built aircraft, but it'll be with a British engine. Again, it's about diversification. It's also about finding an engine which suits them and suits their scenarios. And you have to remember the Swedes are dealing with a national service force. And I will call it a national service force rather than a conscription force, because conscription always comes up with the idea, always creates the idea, it seems, in people's minds, although it's not necessarily true, it depends on the nation, of badly trained, just given a gun and chucked in the field. National service is very different, and the Swedish model is very different. They are given a lot of training, they are motivated, and it's part of their national identity doing it and doing those sort of things. So to an extent, they're far more prepared for it and they're far more understanding of it than necessarily someone who just conscripted from the field and going, yes, give a gun, go that way. This has caused a lot of fun in various NATO exercises recently, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, because some nations' perception of what a conscripted / national service force would be like, and what it was actually like, were very, very different. There were some nations which perceived that their senior officers would have to be running constantly everywhere every time there was a problem. They don't. Again, they have a very good NCO corps, they have a very good officer corps, and they have their national services wrapped around that, and they are well integrated into that. And they're used to it, and they understand that there's sort of training almost from the get-go. In their schools and in various other systems going through, which gives them makes them far more flexible than some of the understandings, some derogatory understandings of perception which permeate quite a lot of literature around conscription armies. It's very different with the Swedish model. But they're also looking for engines and things which are easy to maintain. Why? Because they're going to have maybe one experienced maintainer and 3 or 4 assistants who are on their national service or who have been called up in emergency. So therefore, they need things which are easy to maintain, which means they tend to actually prefer British-built engines, which tend to be easier to build, easier to maintain. Because the British operate on a sort of similar system. Flick back through that. And this leads us to, click the button, the CA313, the company on it. Now, This is not Italy's most beautiful aircraft ever produced, and it certainly wasn't capable of being used as a seaplane or flying a seaplane in any form. Although I think the Swedes possibly did some experimentations on that front, I don't think it worked. What they did do was they managed to build a lot of them. They managed to get the materials, get the things over, put in the engines they wanted, organize it them wanted, and build them themselves. And this becomes one of the most important aircraft the Swedish have. Now in 1939, 1941, they do not have a lot of these. By the end of World War II, they have quite a lot of them in service, but again, it's not thousands of aircraft, it's hundreds. And these are the backbone of their combat air support, of their maritime strike, of a lot of their key capabilities. So while some of these are turned into torpedo bombers, some of them would just be used as general bombers in terms of their anti-shipping role. And that's another reason why quite a lot of those aircraft survive in service, because if you can keep the aircraft going, it's better to have something than nothing. It is better to have something than nothing. It is better to have the two original aircraft, the T1s, as the Swedes call them, in service, than to have nothing. It provides you with a capability. These are probably some of the, by the end of the war, some of the press-produced aircraft operating in European theatre. They're not brilliant by any stretch of the imagination. There are individual aircraft you could pick off which are going to be better than them, faster than them, which are going to be stronger than them, which are going to be more agile than them, which could carry a bigger bomb load than them. But as an all-round aircraft, they are certainly some of the best, if not the best, design operating in Europe by 1945 in terms of the ones in Swedish service, because they are a very flexible asset and the Swedes want to use them as that. And that's really the point. The Swedes are trying to build themselves strategic flexibility. Their defence and security has always been based around strategic flexibility. It's when it's not been strategically flexible, that's when they've had problems. When they haven't properly reinforced their strategic flexibility, that's when they've had issues. They have at times tried to adopt almost a British approach to defence and security, with a strong navy and an army which was interesting, let's say. That hasn't worked for them, because whilst the Baltic is a sea and they have mountains on one side and the Baltic on the other side, they're not an island, and the Baltic freezes over, and they've lost ships to cavalry, let alone all sorts of other issues that have happened. This is the trouble. The Baltic is its own strategic matrix, and when you're walking around Somaliland, or as the Swedes call it, Sverdlov, this island off Helsinki, where there's the whole submarine, the Finnish submarine, which was the genesis of the German U-boat program in many, many ways, where they tested out a lot of their technologies. The Vishenko. You find it very interesting, the sheer amount of efforts built into there to provide a secure base, a secure fortress base for their fleet to rest up and harbour itself and protect itself over winter, when they might be frozen in, but also should they be facing a larger force and they need to withdraw to repair. It's included the whole idea that the dry dock was surrounded by walls, and was have roofing structures over the ships while they're being repaired and while they're being maintained, to enable them to be worked on in all weathers, and also to enable you to better preserve those ships in all weathers. And really, that's where it gets to sort of an interesting point when talking about Sweden and its security and its strategy. They are very much focused on providing themselves with the strategic capability for deterrence and for defense. And it's about mixing the capabilities in to provide a thing of, if you attack X, we can hit you with Y. If you can focus on Y, we can hit you with Z. If you can hit Z, we have A. And if you have attacked A, you then have to deal with X as well. That is the point. The Swedes aren't investing in any one capability over and above the others. They aren't prioritizing anything over the others. They are building themselves up a very flexible assets to provide themselves with the security they need. And these aircraft are part of that. They also have the Saab 18B, which they build and develop themselves. And that is their first, that is the almost post-World War II venture into providing a torpedo bomber. And they're starting working themselves. And this is the thing about what they were aiming for. They were aiming the whole way through to become independent, to build their own industry. That's where the modern Saab industry comes from, the Clarke and all these aircraft which we know and we love and we think about being so good and talk about their capabilities. Well, this was what they were doing in the 20s and 30s. They were building, buying from others the skills the capabilities so they could build and nurture their own industry to grow, to be able to produce aircraft like this. The 18B, it's a very flexible aircraft and very easy to maintain. It's probably not an aircraft at the time which you go, wow, that's the world beater, because the period it's coming out, you're talking about jet aircraft coming into service. But if you actually found yourself up against it, you'd not be a happy person. You would really not be, because it is a very flexible and very maintainable asset, which allows you to operate a lot of them. Well, is there anything else I want to say? Not really. Thank you very much. I always finish these videos with a question, and the question I'm going to ask is this. So, I've put forward the case that what Sweden was pursuing with their aviation development and their key aircraft procurement for torpedo bombers, etc., is strategic security, by having enough to present a threat, to present a problem, and by building up their own industry to do so. The question I'd like to ask, Sweden, as said, is not prepared for war, but they are prepared to prepare for war in the 1930s. There are lots of countries which you could say were not prepared for war in the 1930s. I'd like you to think about how many countries were prepared to prepare for war in the 1930s, in the early 1930s. How many countries? And I'd like you to put that below which countries you think they were and why you think they were prepared to prepare for war. Be really interested to see what your views are. Thank you. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're going to enjoy the videos to come. Now, what have we got coming up? Right then, we have Bo Guerrilla Attacker class are coming out on Tuesday. I'm going to re-record that probably at home. I don't think we're going to be moving for a while. Everything's going through, but paperwork, everything's taken up time. So instead of everything going through while I've been out here, so I go back to move, it's actually been delayed. So who knows what the impact's going to be going forward. I will try and keep you abreast of all that, and I apologize for any disruption it causes. Believe it or not, we started first the discussions and put it in this November last year. We found and liked the house and put in the offer. It was accepted. Now we're in July of the following year. 7 months. And we're moving by a quick methodology, apparently. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you. Take care.